It took over 5 years to get a studio to finally foot the bill for 1980's Raging Bull. Even then, it wouldn't have happened had that studio not desperately wanted Rocky 2.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Let's get into the story of 1980's Raging Bull, directed by Martin Scorsese, screenplay credited to Paul Schrader and Martin, based on Raging Bull, My Story by Jake LaMotta, Joseph Carter and Peter Savage, and starring, of course, Robert De Niro, Joe Pesci, Kathy Moriarty. Very, very long cast list, and a very, very long story, really. So, let's go back into the 1970s to get back into it. And at this point, Robert De Niro and Martin Scorsese were in the midst of making their third film together. They'd done Mean Streets, that had done well. And then they made Taxi Driver, which came out in 1976. And then they were shooting a film called New York, New York, one of the lesser known Scorsese films, really. And it was, De Niro had been reading this book, Raging Bull, My Story by Jake LaMotta. And that's obviously the source of this story, the memoir of boxer Jake LaMotta, a character who it's a very, very candid memoir. LaMotta doesn't come out of it particularly well at all. And it was a book that had got under Robert De Niro's skin. Now, he'd been given the book the first time while he was making Taxi Driver. And LaMotta had written this book with Pete Savage. And Savage hadn't just written the book, he'd penned a screenplay based on it as well, and managed on the set of Taxi Driver to get that to De Niro. De Niro took a look, the script, nah. The book, yes, very, very, very much. And it stayed with the reason the film exists really is in large part down to the tenacity of Robert De Niro and his desire to get it made. He had various different iterations over the 5-6 years before got to a movie set. And so, as per Sean Levy's excellent biography actually of Robert De Niro, there was an early idea of, well, let's do it as a stage play and then shoot the stage play. We could do the play in the afternoon, we could shoot the film in the evening. That might work. Didn't work. The Los Angeles Times, meanwhile, was talking about a film of Raging Bull, although it wasn't called Raging Bull, in going before the cameras in late 1976. At that point, it was called The Prize Fighter. And the trade press over the years would note several possible start dates and false starts for the project, 77, 78, but 76 being the first of them. There'd been various little murmurings of a possible film being made. However, it just wasn't moving forward. It was kind of stuck a little bit. Now, De Niro then also, he passed the book to Martin Scorsese. I'm going to come to him shortly, but he also passed the book to a pair of producers, Irwin Winkler and Robert Chartoff. Producing partners, Irwin Winkler wrote a terrific memoir, A Life in Movies, Stories from 50 Years in Hollywood, well worth checking out. I had the pleasure of spending an hour talking to him earlier this year as well. And it's a terrific story, how he got Raging Bull made, really. But at this stage in the tale, he read the book and he liked what he saw. And as he wrote in his memoir, he didn't just see a fight film, and they'd just done Rocky at this point, very, very pivotal. But also what Irwin Winkler really liked was it looked into the soul of Jake LaMotta and what the violence in the ring had brought to his life outside the ring. So he was interested now. But this wasn't a project going around in isolation. There were other parties sniffing around. And there was a point in the mid-1970s, perhaps just edging into the late 1970s, where the rights had already been picked up by Dino De Laurentiis, a legendary producer. And De Laurentiis was inclined to make a film of this, but it was De Niro who would, in the end, persuade De Laurentiis to hand over the rights. And, to the surprise of many, he did just that. And Irwin Winkler, Robert Chartoff got the rights. They agreed to produce the film. Rocky was exploding for them. They'd won Best Picture at the Oscars. And development work began on a screenplay for the film. Now, there's already the Pete Savage one. That was not going to be used at all. And so we go back to the set of New York, New York, where De Niro introduces Scorsese to this Raging Bull project. Scorsese, not interested. Not a boxing fan, never really got into it. He'd enjoyed Rocky, but at this point, his trajectory was up and there were two passion projects he really wanted to make. He really wanted to do The Last Temptation of Christ, and he really, really wanted to do a film called Gangs of New York. It would take a long time to get both of those off the ground. Both will cause him differing amounts of trouble. But for the point of this story, Raging Bull, not interested at that point. Now, Martin came in, he'd done a bit of work on Mean Streets, he'd done a bit of work on New York, New York. He was hired to come up with a Raging Bull script, and he threw himself into the research. He went and lived with Jake Lamotta for a few days as part of that. Scorsese, still distant, not involved. In fact, Scorsese was sort of almost on the side, making The Last Waltz. If you look at Rebecca Miller's excellent Mr. Scorsese documentary on Apple TV, I mean, it talks about how he was basically making The Last Waltz as a side project. I mean, but Scorsese was very, very busy throwing himself into his work. And also Martin's script came in and it didn't really pass muster. And so De Niro was having various attempts to move this forward, but the points were not aligning at the stage they needed to. Now, separately, New York comes out, doesn't do great business at all. And all of a sudden, this career that was going right up had suddenly hit its first major problem, that the critics didn't like the film, the audiences didn't. Taxi Driver had been this huge success. Mean Streets had put him on the map. It's just like, okay, now there's a problem. He was also, again, this is discussed in the Mr. Scorsese documentary, he was utilising one or two things at this stage in his life, Scorsese, and struggling in his home life. And the commercial failure of New York really didn't help. And bluntly, he was getting ill, and he was about to find out just how ill he was getting, because in September 1978, on a trip to the Telluride Film Festival, he collapsed. And this is the moment where, basically, he nearly died. He's in hospital. He nearly didn't make it, was in real danger of a brain hemorrhage, and could have just been wiped out just like that. Imagine, not just the personal tragedy of that, the cinema tragedy of that. De Niro visited his friend, really concerned. Scorsese's life at this point, even aside from the health concerns, was in danger of going off the rails a little bit. And it was De Niro who basically said, you need to make you've got to make things. You've got to make films. This is what you loved it. And he put forward Raging Bull, again, at the point while Scorsese was recovering from the moment that had nearly killed him. De Niro had been, he committed to Michael Cimino's The Deer Hunter at the point where the script wasn't quite there for Raging Bull, and Scorsese wasn't really ready to jump onto it. So for a bit of R&R, he goes and makes a film with Michael Cimino. All right. But recovering from his very, very significant health scare, Scorsese, decided, all right, Raging Bull, I'm going to do it. Now, there was still work to be done here, that they needed a new script for a start, that the Martin one was good. It was very linear. It wasn't a radical retelling of the Jake LaMotta story. Obviously, the earlier Pete Savage one, that wasn't passing muster. It didn't even get past De Niro. And so they brought in Paul Schrader, of course, written Taxi Driver, and he came in, I think it was for about $150,000. And he took a look and went away with it. And he was the one who restructured this a lot, and he elevated the character in the film of Joey LaMotta as a key force in Jake LaMotta's life in the film version of his story. Pete Savage, meanwhile, if you remember, co-author of the book, writer of the screenplay, was initially very prominent in the scripts that were being written, now pretty much cut out of the film and wasn't going to be happy about it. Schrader delivered a much better script and something much more of interest to De Niro and Scorsese. Robert Chartoff and Winkler, they still weren't 100% there on it, but it was Schrader and they who just suggested that De Niro and Scorsese go away and do some work on it themselves. Work the dialogue out, work out how this works for you. And it's just what they did. Went away for a couple of weeks, tuned it, made some nips and tucks, put some different touches on it, different emphasis. There's a feeling that they finally had their script. What they didn't have was their money, because as much of this has been going through development for years, finding someone to pay the bill for this was tricky. The natural home for the movie, felt when Winkler and Robert Chartoff, was United Artists, and United Artists was happily enjoying the money that Rocky was bringing in. It was going to spend the money on a film called Heaven's Gate. Very wise investment there. United Artists, though, had made New York, had been stung a bit by that commercially. And also, the management that had worked with Scorsese a few years before had changed. It was, I mean, it was heading into the production of Heaven's Gate. That was tricky. In came Stephen Back and David Field to run United Artists at this point, and they just told Irwin Winkler that financing Raging Bull was just a no-no. Heaven's Gate was stretching them too much. They just couldn't afford the gamble here. It was too big a risk. Also, there are other companies just making boxing films at that point, and this Raging Bull, I mean, it didn't look as appreciating. No one really felt Rocky was like this big commercial thing when it was first being pitched. Raging Bull looked like a bit of a tough sell. So it was down to Irwin Winkler really to have a bit of a brainwave. And so a meeting was arranged with the executives of United Artists, and they duly reported that they didn't like this character, Jake LaMotta, and understandably as well, there wasn't the interest there, and it just wasn't looking good. But what Winkler and Chartoff had was a really significant chip in their back pocket, because they had a film that United Artists, stretched for cash at this point, really wanted and also really needed: Rocky 2. Winkler played hardball. It was made very, very clear to United Artists that if it did not back Raging Bull, you ain't having Rocky 2. And United Artists backed down. He won his gamble. The green light for Raging Bull was finally given. Now, the budget involved, $18 million, was not insignificant as well. I keep using as a yardstick like Gremlins, which looks an expensive film, made, 83-ish? And cost around, $8-9 million to make. Raging Bull was not a cheap film. It wasn't wildly expensive, but still, it was a financial gamble for United Artists. But still, they finally had their money. They finally had a commitment to do it. And Michael Cimino, as a result of Raging Bull going forward, wasn't able to offer De Niro a part in Heaven's Gate. I mean, that was a bullet that might be dodged. But the money and backing sorted, De Niro then throws himself as his legend into his preparation for the role. Sean Levy's biography I mentioned before, I mentioned it a couple of times telling these stories. I mean, it's a really good book. He's just done one on Clint Eastwood, which I'm just starting to read as well. And I mean, it talks about, at this stage in his career, De Niro's process was very, very intense. You go into the back end of the book, and as the post-Rocky and Bullwinkle moments, I think De Niro was a little bit, I wouldn't use the word relaxed, but perhaps less intense with some of the preparation for some of the role, but this was straight down the line. He threw himself into it. I mean, there are reports that he was trained for a year, 6 months, 8 months, 9 months. That notwithstanding, it was a lot of work. And he worked with Jake LaMotta for several months to be able to portray him on screen as a competitive boxer. I mean, he learned to box. In Taxi Driver, he drove a cab as part of his preparation. Here he was learning to box to the point where he ended up taking on a couple of professional fighters. Didn't win the fight, but he got into the ring with professional fighters, did not disgrace himself at all. Also, his body weight was going to have to fluctuate significantly for the film. Again, part of its legend. I'll come to that shortly. Now, Joe Pesci, there's a terrific book, Martin Scorsese, A Journey by Mary Pat Kelly, which is well worth digging out. And I mean, Joe Pesci tells a bit of his story in there because he'd come to the attention of Martin Scorsese in an independent movie called The Debt Collector. And Scorsese saw something in him and brought him in as Jake's brother in the film. It was Pesci, in turn, who recommended an actor who was working at a local Italian restaurant who might just suit the film. Her name? Kathy Moriarty. She'd never acted before, but came in for a screen test and was swiftly cast. A career there was born. But going back to Pesci, what he told Mary Pat Kelly in that book was, I was worn out trying to be an actor. I had given up. I didn't want to get involved in acting again because I didn't like the business of acting. He liked acting as an art. And he'd been a child actor. He'd been working since he was 4 or 5 years old on stage. And he said, I hadn't done any films until 75. And that's the one that Bobby, Robert De Niro, and Martin Scorsese saw me in, The Death Collector. In the beginning, I really didn't care because the part of Jake's brother was small. I figured they should give it to a working actor who really wanted it. And he said, at the time, I was running a restaurant in the Bronx for some friends of mine. I was out of that place in Hollywood where you're at everyone's mercy all the time. And he just said, you get to a point there where you bump into the walls and say, excuse me, so as not to offend anybody so you can get a job. And Pesci said, I just wanted to get away from all of that and back into the position where everybody treated you like a man. Then I met Marty and Bob. I saw that working with them would be different, and he accepted the role in the film. Now, part and parcel of the process of the film is Scorsese built in time for rehearsals as well, and that was important too. And then also, I mean, going into the process of why it just said, between New York and Raging Bull, in my personal life and also in my career, I was very disappointed. And he discussed how people loved Mean Streets. Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, which he made, Taxi Driver. We've got wonderful reviews. We've got good box office for both Alice and Taxi Driver. But Scorsese, again, told Mary Pat Kelly, nobody liked New York. It was as if we'd done something absolutely dreadful. And I said, wait a second, the picture is not dreadful, and it isn't. I mean, there are problems with it, but he just said, I became very disillusioned with the whole process. Everything was very destructive. It was very bad for me. And in the fall of 1978, at the point he had his health scare in Telluride, everything clicked together. I kind of woke up and said, this is the picture that has to be made, and I'll make it that way. These are the reasons why it has to be made, for me anyway. The Mr. Scorsese documentary hints at how angry and wound up Scorsese was getting during this time. It didn't sound at that point in his career like it was particularly nice to be around. But again, I wasn't there. I'm just seeing the stories from the outside. His way into this, what ultimately clicked, he wanted to explore the story of a man with a self-destructive lifestyle. It wasn't necessarily the boxing, it was that character. And I mean, it was, he could find a way into that story. And in April 1979, what, half a decade after De Niro had first become aware of this, Raging Bull could finally start shooting. And as Scorsese said, I remembered the first day of shooting Raging Bull. Paul Schrader sent me a telegram saying, I did it my way. Jake Lamotta did it his way. You do it your way. And he just said it kind of gave me a certain kind of freedom then to move in the film. That said, a lot of prep had gone into this, a lot of storyboarding. The choreographing of the fights in particular, it was intense. Tom Sean wrote in his book about Scorsese as well. He just tells the story of how De Niro and Scorsese split the salaries as a kind of sign of trust on the film. And then just to cheer United Artists up, which was putting significant resources into the movie, Scorsese had made this early decision to shoot Raging Bull in black and white. That is not a box office gold decision. By history will tell you that. There are very few films that break through done in black and white. And the argument was that most people who were watching boxing when Jake LaMotta was on television saw him in black and white on black and white television sets. Now, this presented, if they were going to then do it in colour, how are they going to present the colours of the bouts when they didn't have that much reference material? And would it work anyway? Would it capture all these questions? And they could have gone down a more conventional route, but Scorsese just didn't want it, not least for how it would bring out the blood on screen as well. Helpful with the MPAA that it was in black and white. So the first things that were shot were those incredible boxing scenes in the movie. They were done in Los Angeles before the rest of the film moved elsewhere. And for those boxing sequences, Jake LaMotta was on set. He was asked to stay away when the dramatic stuff was being shot, but for the boxing stuff, he was on set. In terms of the influence on those fight scenes, I mean, Scorsese hadn't been to a fight. And then, and so he decided to go to one. He just said, I went to one with Brian De Palma and some other friends. We sat in the bleachers. And from there, I saw the sponge go into the pail. The trainer squeezed it over the fighter's back. It was full of blood. That was pretty interesting. And he talked about how in Raging Bull, all the fight scenes are done in drawings. And he just described it as staging a dance to music. Instead of a verse with maybe 12 bars of music, 4 bars of punching or something like that. And it's down to the choreography. It was shot with one camera. We're not going Ridley Scott, 11 cameras everywhere. And they would do X number of punches, then a tracking shot, another camera move there. And the fight scenes had to be shot over and over and over again to hit the choreography of them. They could sometimes, I mean, it was really slow, this part of the filming. Sometimes they could just get 2 or 3 shots a day. And I mean, De Niro had to be on it. They had to get the rhythm of the slow motion that Scorsese wanted as well. And in the end, De Niro put a punch bag in the ring so that he could be punching away. And then when he's called over for the shot, he was ready for it. They'd scheduled 5 weeks to shoot the fight scenes in Raging Bull. They needed 10 in the end, another 10 weeks really for the drama. But then also they had to put the film on hiatus because for the latter part of the story, they needed, or certainly of the filming, they needed De Niro as Jake LaMotta to have put on weight. So De Niro went off to Europe and ate and put this weight on. And only then, once he'd done that, could they bring him back and Scorsese would get the shots that he needed. But it's one of the earliest high-profile cases of an actor doing dramatic weight loss and gain for a role. Tom Hanks has talked about this. He did it for Castaway a lot further down the line, and how it's in part triggered his type 2 diabetes and regarded as a very dangerous thing to do. De Niro, full commitment to it, that he was for a long time the poster child, really, for this kind of radical body transformation that actors would sometimes go through for a role. When it came for the fights as well, Scorsese was bringing in real boxers as well, and that, like, the furniture, the people around boxing matches, he tried to veer away from actors a little bit there. And he also played a trick by changing the physical size of the boxing ring depending on the fight in particular that they were shooting and where LaMotta's head was at any given time. Once they'd shot all the fight scenes, they went over to New York. They shot around the neighborhoods where Scorsese and De Niro had grown up, really. And this film that began shooting in April 1979 wouldn't wrap up until December 1979, including the pauses in production that they needed to do to accommodate the transformation that De Niro needed to make. There had originally, as it went into post-production, been talk of United Artists putting this film out in the summer of 1980, but it was clear that the post-production would not be done in time. And one of the magic ingredients of the film was a reunion between Martin Scorsese and his editor, Thelma Schoonmaker, who's gone on to edit every film Scorsese's done since. But there'd been, nearly a decade break in their working career at this point. They'd worked together on 1970s Woodstock documentary, and I think they had another project around 1970 as well, gone off in different ways. Schoonmaker had never done a feature film as an editor, remarkably, at this point. She'd been working primarily in documentaries. And she said to him, I've never cut a feature before. And Scorsese's just like, we'll do it together. It will be okay. Now, she would tell Mary Pat Kelly that we were working all night on this edit. She said, I'm not a night person. I've never adjusted to working all night. But in that solitude, she argued, we found an incredible ability to concentrate. And she said, it was enjoyable working on it, even though a lot of people consider it a very brutal film, understandably so. But she said working on Raging Bull was one of our best times. We edited in Marty's apartment, the tininess of the room, the quality of the work, and Marty in his kimono, watching film after film on video while we were working, made it very special. Scorsese also would damage the actual physical negative for the home movie segments required in the film. He would scratch it. I'd do it the old-fashioned way. And so there was also this hard deadline that needed to be hit because United Artists needed it for the end of 1980. Heaven's Gate was threatening to drag the company down. It did drag the company down. And Heaven's Gate is a whole huge story about one film in the end bringing down an entire company. Raging Bull was going through while United Artists was partly distracted or heavily distracted by what was going on with Heaven's Gate, but it still needed its film. And there was a hard deadline in the end to hit, and it got to the point where Irving Winkler told Martin Scorsese, you've got till midnight on this given day to lock this, and then it's got to go. And even then, there was a minor bit of dialogue that Scorsese was just like, I can't hear that properly. And Winkler just said, you're out of time. It's got to go. No time to change it. Scorsese at that point threatens to take his name off Raging Bull as director. I mean, I'll put my name on if you want. It's fine. Winkler, though, didn't back down. And in the end, Scorsese would relent on this. And the film would finally debut November the 14th, 1980 in New York City before going on a wide release in the US the month after. The critical response was distracted to a degree by the violence in the film. The boxing matches in particular, very, very, very brutal. And the use of blood in those is still incredibly stark. And also Jake LaMotta, in and out of the ring, a violent cauldron of a man, really. Some of the people who reviewed it saw it straight away and adored it. Really, really loved it. Really, really loved it. Nobody disliked it that I could find. I read through lots of vintage reviews. There wasn't anyone gunning against the film, but in terms of the acclaim it's regarded with now, it wasn't quite at that level. I mean, I should note it got 8 Oscar nominations in the end for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Supporting Actress, Cinematography, Editing, and Sound. But the initial response to it was, as much as the critics had been broadly on its side, well, the box office just didn't click. And so we go to that New York release. It did what? We're on 1980 numbers, so contextualizing it that way. Terrific opening, $128,000 off 4 screens. Screen average of $32,000 would look amazing today. But it was restricted to New York for its first few weeks on release. It would be bringing in the money, and by the time it gets to the wider release in America, the New York screenings alone on 4 screens have brought in nearly $1 million. United Artists needed this to work when it went broader, though, and so 19th to the 21st, it ups the cinema count from 4 to 180, is rewarded with $640,000 weekend take. The problem was at the other end of that, Any Which Way You Can, the Clint Eastwood sequel, remember that? Opens with $8 million. It's a fair contrast. 9 to 5 opens with nearly $4 million. And Raging Bull, as much as it's getting the acclaim, as much as it's interesting the Oscars, it's becoming clear it's not going to do the kind of numbers United Artists needed it to do. It did around $10 million at the US box office, I think, on its original. I mean, its worldwide take is around the $23 million mark. And so by the time you take out cinema cut and stuff like that, this was another case of a film that wasn't going into profit anytime soon. And it was a real concern for Scorsese that as a result of that, his career was back in the doldrums. The Oscars certainly helped a little bit, and you go down the Oscars that it did win. I mean, Scorsese didn't win, of course. I mean, he wouldn't win until The Departed, but it's really interesting. I mean, you look at the accolades. Robert De Niro wins for Best Actor. First time editing a feature, Thelma Schumacher wins for Best Editor. And I'm really taken with the fact that Kathy Moriarty was just waiting tables in an Italian restaurant, hadn't acted, her first film role, Best Supporting Actress nomination. It takes home 2 of the Academy Awards it's nominated for. It's defeated by Robert Redford's Ordinary People that year. And that, you would think, is pretty much that the Raging Bull story stops, and you look at, Scorsese after that moves on to The King of Comedy in 82. That doesn't do great guns either. And I mean, there is a fairly instant impact on this as well, that the failure inverted commas of Raging Bull meant his chances of getting The Last Temptation of Christ going anytime soon were gone. Gangs of New York, the chances of that, were just completely taken down, really, and wouldn't resurface for a couple of decades with Harvey Weinstein involved. 5 days after Raging Bull premieres, Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate comes out for United Artists, destroys the company, and that takes away a source of funding for Scorsese's film. There's no way United Artists can pay for anything. It's just about to go out of business. And he goes through a really fallow patch in his career. Then December 1980, Joey LaMotta was planning a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the film, against the individuals involved for defamation of character. And then there was another lawsuit with Joseph Carter, one of the also authors of Jake LaMotta's memoir. Wasn't happy. And there were a couple of legal skirmishes after the film. There is, though, there was clearly a happy ending of sorts with the Raging Bull story. And it pops up in the Mr. Scorsese documentary that Scorsese gets to 1990 after a tricky decade for him. You look at the 80s. After Hours was well received and was sort of a comeback film. The Colour of Money was the one that re-established him as someone Hollywood would trust with its money. You get to 1990, he makes Goodfellas, arguably the most acclaimed film of that year. Doesn't win Best Picture, that goes to Kevin Costner, Dances with Wolves, but Goodfellas, flat out masterpiece. And he reflects in the documentary as well that at that point, Raging Bull, this film that had caused so much anguish, really, is then voted the best film of the 1980s. It took a long time to get it to the screen, and perhaps it took a long time for it to get the recognition it deserves, but Raging Bull remains to this day a flat-out masterpiece, and against very, very tough competition, one of Martin Scorsese's best ever films. Rocky II wasn't bad, though.